This is an oral history recording for the Fannin County Historical Commission. Margaret Finley will be the interviewer, and Mr. W.B. Leeman is the interviewee.
So we'll wait for you.
Oh, go ahead.
W.B., you have told me so many stories that I have so thoroughly enjoyed. You're just a walking history book. And I just feel that you should share it with all of Fannin County and the people who are to come 50 years or 100 years from now, if this tape holds up that long. Would you tell us who you are and where you were born and when you were born and how you started out in Fannin County?
Well, I was born in Honey Grove in 1902. My name is W.B. Leeman, and my father came to here as deputy sheriff and worked for Philip Wise. Philip Wise was from Ladonia and was constable down there, and he ran for sheriff and was elected. And my father came here in
What year?
1904.
Okay.
But my father didn't come in here. We didn't move here until 1905. And I do remember coming here and how muddy it was on the way from Honey Grove. And after that, Mr. Wise was defeated and Mr. Bridge was elected sheriff. And after that, Dad was elected sheriff, and we stayed here, and he was sheriff from 1911 till 14 or 15. And then we moved back to Honey Grove, and he had the Ford agency there for a good many years. And when Mr. Whitley was elected sheriff of Fannin County, Dad came back here and worked for him. He was a peace officer for 42 years.
Well, I understand that part of the time you lived in the county jail.
We lived in the county jail while we were building a house on, it was East 4th Street then, which is now Sam Rayburn Drive. And we stayed there.
Well, what was it like? What were the facilities there?
Well, the facilities...
He didn't lock you up at night, did he?
No. Well, the front door was locked. keep the inmates in. But the whole east end of the jail was for the sheriff's wife, sheriff and his wife. And
was that the first jail Bonham ever had?
no, the first jail was a log cabin, and later it was stuccoed and fixed up just over the logs.
At the same location?
At the same location, and then they built the center part, which is out of native stone, like the courthouse is built. And then the east end, where the sheriff's quarter was made out of late model brick, and was a later model. Of course, there were cells above it. They called the cell above the second jail, they called it number 4. And it was supposed to have been the best one. And the one over the old wooden part was number 1, and they kept the colored folks there, blacks. And they usually had somebody, of course they didn't have a fire in the cells, but they had fires all around there to keep it warm through the winter. And they usually had a trusty or something to keep the fires, and it was done with coal at that time. I never will forget, we had a colored man from Ladonia. He wasn't crazy, he just wasn't bright. And he would stay up all night, and every time the clock would strike, he'd holler out, 3 o'clock and all's well. And he was quite a nuisance. And he would beat on the iron floor with a chunk of coal, and we had to take the coal away from him, and then he used his shoes to beat on the floor and wake people up for the hour. I don't know when he slept, but we carried him to Austin, and on the train down there we had to ride with the blacks, and had to have him on the inside because he'd get up and wander around. And the news butch and the man that carried the fruit around, he always wanted an apple. He called them apps. He wanted an app, and so we fed him apps. But before that, we had to stop in Bells to get the train, and of course we knew he was all right if he wouldn't do anything wrong intentionally. And we went into the ticket agent's office, and they hadn't raised the window, but everything was in there to build a fire with, and he'd put all the clothes he had, instead of taking them in a suitcase or something, he'd put them on, coats and overcoats and all. And the ticket agent got hot, and he wiped the sweat from his brow, and raised the window, and Charlie Baxter had that old stove in there in the waiting room, red hot stovepipe and all, clear to the ceiling. And when we got him down there, why, that's the last I've ever heard of Charlie.
Well, did you have any big jailbreaks or anything while you were living there, or while you were close to the action?
Well, let's see, when Wilson was elected president, they had a big rally in front of the jail, and that was called the jockey yard at that time, and they were shooting anvils and doing all things that make all kind of noise. And this number 4 cell that was the strongest in the jail, it had a boy in the runaround that wouldn't try to escape, and he's the one that kept fires and things. But he somewhere or other tripped the lock on the cell, and Tom Farmer and Squee Cobb, now what Squee's first name was I don't know, and another boy escaped. And Squee called us from Chicago. He was getting hungry and called my father to come and get him. And whatever happened to Tom Farmer, I don't know, but Squee told us that Tom Farmer would pray and all through the night and all, and the next day would rob somebody to get money to live on. But whatever become of Tom Farmer, we don't know. And that's the only jailbreak that I know of.
Well, after you moved down in your house, that backed up to Catherine's Park, didn't it?
Yes.
Well, I understand we had a famous hanging tree there. Do you remember that?
I don't remember it. I remember my cousin, Dr. Henry Leeman from Wyndham, telling about it. He was going to school at Carleton College. They had dormitories for the girls, but none for the boys. And he lived down there on East 4th Street. And when they came by the jail with the Dyer brothers to carry him down there to hang him, he went down that way with them. And that's all I know about that. And they were hung down there at the end of the alley below our house. That's a bodark tree, and I don't know what the bodark tree is still there. I'm sure it's living if it hadn't been destroyed by humans.
Well, you mentioned the jockey yard and it backing up to the jail and everything. I'm sure that anybody growing up today doesn't know what the jockey yard is or what the wagon yard is. So would you explain the way they use both of those?
Well, the jockey yard was across the street from the jail, south of the jail, and it was used on more than anything else on trades days. First Mondays they called them. That was a trades day. People came from everywhere to trade their horses and mules and cows or whatever they had. They traded guns and anything that they had to trade, and that was called a jockey yard. I don't know why they called it jockey yard, because they
had to jockey for position, I guess.
I guess they did, and they'd celebrate that, or I guess you'd call it celebrated, because it was a big to do every first Monday in the month. And the wagon yard that was still south of that belonged to, I can't call his name right now,
Mr. Harden?
Mr. Harden, yes it was. And it was used to keep the stock and stuff in that was valuable and all, and they didn't want to leave them out in the weather. And people camped there. They had camp houses, they called them, and you could stay there pretty cheap if you had a family and wanted to stay in there. Most of them stayed up and down the highways in the covered wagons.
Well, it probably was a day or two's trip for a lot of them to get to Bonham back in those days.
I'm sure it was.
Because Fannin County was a big county.
Well, they came from all over the country. I don't know if there's all from Fannin County, but about 30 miles a day is the best you could get with a good team. And I'd say 15 or 20 miles with some of the rigs that they had.
Well, after you grew up a little bit, well, you went to work for the fire department.
Yes.
I think you weren't quite old enough, well, I don't know if to say old enough or young enough for the trucks to be pulled by horses, but tell us about your early days in the year.
Well, it was after the war was over, at the First World War, and they were shy of volunteer fire department, firemen, and I had to get consent from my mother and father to join because I wasn't 21 years old. But that was sometime after 1918, and then I was fireman until 1951 or 2.
Well, what were the biggest fires you had way back early?
Well, the courthouse was one of the biggest, I guess, when the courthouse burned. I believe that was in 1929, about the 30th of 1920, December the 30th. It was decorated with Christmas lights and all, and they figured that shorten the lights started it, and the whole top burned out of it. And I guess that was about the biggest fire. The east side of the square burned out one time. That was a pretty big fire.
Now, what was on the east side that burned?
Titsworth's furniture store, and there was a dry goods store and a hardware store on the corner.
Now, this was directly across the street from the courthouse.
That's east of the courthouse, on the corner, on Center and 5th, the corner where the house was.
Well, I thought I remembered as a child that there used to be prisoners, or there used to be a jail in top of the courthouse. Was that right?
No, not that I ever knew of.
Maybe I'm in the wrong town.
You're in McKinney or Greenwood.
Well, now, you told me about a pair of runaway horses one day that I thought was most interesting. Would you tell us about that?
Well, this team belonged to Pete Halsell. Now, Pete Halsell and Ben Baker owned the Baker and Halsell liver stable, and they were catered to the elite. They had fine cabs and all, and they met every train. We had 6 trains a day, passenger trains come through here, and they met those trains and those cabs and fine horses and all. And they used those cabs and all in weddings and things like that. It was, like I say, for the more elite. And Pete Halsell had a fine team of horses hitched to a buggy, and they came up West 6th Street, and they ran into they tried to turn that corner and couldn't make it. They were running too fast, and they ran into the show window at MC Spivey and Company's dry goods store.
And just where is that located so that they'll know now?
Right across from Safeway, south.
On the east side of Main Street.
And both horses died in that window. That plate glass cut them all to pieces. And Pete cried like a baby.
Boy, I bet the horses did too. Okay, now, you told me once about some history that you heard about the James brothers, and just how is your family connected in the James brothers?
My grandmother was Mary Jane James, and she and Jesse were either brother and sister or cousins. I really don't know for sure, but I remember that Frank James, after he was pardoned, came back through here and stopped at our house. I don't remember what he looked like. I was too young, but he was going to Dallas to work for A. Harrison Company as a floor walker, more of an advertisement than anything else. And I remember he did say that there was a lot of that robbing and all was laid on to the James brothers that they didn't do. And later, Mr. James died, and she married, I can't think of, Samuels. She married a Mr. Samuels, who was a Methodist preacher. And the railroad came through there and wanted their land or something. I never did know for sure what it was, but they threw a bomb into the house because they wouldn't sell, and she was severely injured. And that's what started the James brothers on their outlaw trail and doing damage to the railroad more than anything else. And that's about all I remember about that.
Well, I guess that's the better part to remember. I guess everybody else can play up the bad part, but since he's related to you, we won't say he's that bad. You told me once about the electricity being out in Bonham, and you had a hard time pumping gas. What did you do?
Well, that was during an ice storm, and the electricity was off, and the people in the front of, I had a shop in the back of everybody's garage, I guess it was at that time,
Where was the location?
on the southeast corner of the square. And the Dura boys run the front of it. And I rigged up a bicycle and took a belt off the air compressor and put on the wheel of the bicycle and run it to the pump. And Willie Ford, a little black boy that worked there, rode the bicycle and pumped the gas. And we had about the only pump station going in town.
Do you remember what year that was?
No, I don't. During one of the ice storms when we was out of electricity.
Well, from a lot of our conversations, I gathered that you were kind of a young man about town, and you always kept up with all the new things and the popular things, and I think making and drinking home brew was one of them.
Well, yeah.
You want to tell us how your recipe for home brew?
No, I don't know the recipe. I've forgotten that, thank goodness. But we used to make it, and I remember we bought the hops and the yeast and all that stuff, and we used a big crock jug. And we made it. And my father was a teetotaler, and we did it on the sly, but he never went out to the garage after we sold the car. And that was a good place to make it because it'd get warm and ferment real quick. And I remember one time we got to making it, and Mr. W.E. Newton, who was, you don't call him elder, steward in the Methodist church, and was a teetotaler. But Ewell and I wasn't, and we made home brew.
And Ewell was his son?
Ewell was his son. And we made home brew in a little place out at the back that he used to render lard with when we used to have our own slaughter pens here and didn't ship the meat in.
Well, he had a grocery store too, didn't he?
Yeah, that was the back of his grocery store, and the gas company had an office there, and they had a big light out the back, and there was a big old table out the back, and we used to bottle it on that table. And the night watchman would come along and help us.
I guess he got to drink some of it too, didn't he?
Well, I don't remember that. Not on the job.
Well, that's about all that I can remember offhand. But now you put your memory to test, and is there anything else that you think would be interesting that's way back in the history?
Well, I remember my grandparents telling about when they came here from Kentucky. He was sheriff and tax assessor in the county that Bowling Green's in. Now, I don't know what county that is. But he moved here, and when they crossed the river, he had so much stock and all, it would cost a lot of money to put them across on the ferry, and they swam the horses across the river. And one of them turned around and swam back, and they didn't go get him. They let him go. And then they came to and stopped in Honey Grove and stayed there. His name was Sam Leeman. He was a small man, and he had 21 children by my grandmother, Mary Jane James, and his first wife, who I don't know who was, but there was 21 boys and girls. And the last one of that family died a few weeks ago. His name was George Corley. And that's the last cousin I have.
Well, it's too bad that football or baseball wasn't real popular back in those days. They had their own team.
Well, they could have.
Back in the days before we had cars and stuff, you remember your first car. You used to either ride with the sheriff or drive for him. Mm-hmm. What kind of cars did they have to catch the speeders back in those days? Could the horses outrun the cars?
Well, they probably could, but they used Model Ts mostly. Now, Mr. Whitley had a Model T the first time he was sheriff, and he never would drive. And, of course, I was going to school, and I drove for him on holidays and Saturdays and Sundays. And we never will forget, we went to the river one time. They had a place down there called Pope's Cutoff. And the outlaws would congregate down there, and when the Fannin County Sheriff would go down there to get them, they'd claim they was in Bryan County, Oklahoma, and so we all met down there one time and stopped all that. And coming back, we had to cross the ferry, and when they did, R.E. Snow, they call him Reasons, he was in the buggy with us, Well, he was in a buggy, and he jumped out, and he had put his pistol in his belt and let the hammer down over the belt so it wouldn't fall out, and it was down. And when he jumped out of the buggy, it cocked itself and went off, and powder burned him all down the leg, and he jumped in the river to put it out. And he had a car, a 490 Chevrolet, and we tore the back end out of the one we were driving, coming up off of the ferry. And he brought us home in that old Chevrolet. And when he got here, they arrested him for shooting a man. And he said, I didn't think you knew I did it, and I know I didn't kill him. Said, I don't know what it's all about. But they all went on his bond and sent him back home.
Was he from Bonham?
No, he was from down there. He ran the ferry.
Oh. Well, can you search the mine anymore?
No, I don't think so.
Well, I guess we can take a break along about here because I don't know of anything else to ask you just right now. Lou, is there anything that you'd like to know?
Well, I think it's very interesting. I have only lived in Bonham about 18 years altogether,
Mhm.
and so I'm a newcomer. But I'm really fascinated by these tales,
Now, I remember Sam Rayburn bought a farm out just west of the drive-in theater, and it had a hall down through the middle, a great big hall and a tin roof on it and a house and all. And he'd bought it, and he was out there looking at it, and the man that lived on the farm was with him, and he was out there in the barn, and the man that lived there told him that the barn was full of fleas. And some farmer came along and saw Mr. Sam out there, and of course everybody knew him, and he stopped and came in there, and they were telling him about the fleas, and he says, Sam, why don't you shoot them? And he says, shoot them? What do you mean? He said, just get your shotgun here and shoot and round in here. So they'll all leave. And he didn't have his gun with him, so he sent Tom Rayburn back to his house and back to Tom's house, and he got a gun and brought up there to shoot them with. And they had it loaded, and Tom didn't know a dirt dauber built a nest in the barrel. And when he shot it, it blew the end of the barrel off and like it carried all of the roof off of the barn. And somebody said, well, did the fleas leave? He said, they sure did. Said, everybody left.
Well, you cleaned that up a little bit, didn't you?
Well, yes.
Well, he was a very colorful man, wasn't he?
Oh, yes, he was. He was. He used to come, I used to do his work on his car. He used to come out there quite a bit and talk. And we all thought President Truman was one of the finest men that ever was. He did. And I guess it's because he was like Mr. Sam. He said what he thought. You could always tell how he was hooked and how he thought.
They don't make them like that anymore, I don't
No,
believe.
they don't. B. Johnson at the Bonham John Malto Company. Why, I got a call about 2 o'clock in the morning that Rosa Crossett at Petty. And the old road used to come up on the south side of the railroad track till you got near Petty, and then they'd cross the track and come up on the north side of Petty. Well, Rosie didn't turn that corner short enough. He went out across the railroad track and broke a wheel down and ran into the pool. And he called me to come and get him. And in those days we didn't have a wrecker, we had a dolly. You had to jack the car up and put it on it to pull it back. And going across the square, I met Clara's brother-in-law, Clyde Markwood. That was before you married. And I asked him to go with me. Of course, he knew Rosie. And we went down there, and I met Rosie this side of the Petty, and he wanted to know where we'd been. I had to cut out on the car so I could attract his attention. And he came up out of the ditch and wanted to know where we'd been. And I told him we was on our way. And he said, well, that's toward Paris. And I said, no, that's toward Bonham, Rosie. And so we went on down there and found the car. Finally got it out and got it on the dolly. And he says, where's Jack? And I said, Jack who? She said, Jack Fincher. I said, I don't know. I haven't seen Jack Fincher. But we looked, and we dredged the pool with a piece of barbed wire, and we didn't find anybody. And I looked up and down the track, and I didn't find Jack anywhere. So I said, we might as well go home. There's no use in staying here. So we came on home. Jack came home from Paris on the noon train the next day. Rosie hadn't left there with him.
Well, I guess Paris must have been wet in those days.
Well, no, I think it was during Prohibition, and that was the worst time in the world for whiskey because they made some of the rottenest stuff that ever was. I remember one time getting a still, they call it blanket whiskey. They'd make it steam and catch it in a blanket and wring the blanket out and make the whiskey. Now, I don't know whether the blanket is clean or not, but I guess the whiskey killed the germs.
That's good.
And we'd find they'd bury barrels of mash in the ground, keep it from being discovered, and we'd find those mash barrels, and there'd be rabbits in them and this, that, and the other, and they'd get drunk and fall in, I guess. But I guess they'd just kick them out and go ahead and cook it off anyway.
Oh, boy.
Now, that was all over in Lamar County? We didn't have anything like that in Fannin County.
Oh, yes, we did have it in Fannin County, the worst in the world. I don't know about Lamar County. But
Well, down at Elwood, way back in the 1820s, I think, they had a legal still down there, didn't they?
I imagine they did that far back. I imagine they did. I'll never forget Tom Cooper. I imagine he was selling whiskey to the Indians over across the river. And he and an Indian agent got in an argument over there. And the Indian, Tom said, the Indian agent's gun snapped and his didn't. And he had to swim the river and come home, and he got all his belongings together. He had the Indian agent's gun, a 45-70 Springfield rifle. And he swam the river and brought that gun back, but he had to leave. He went to Canada and stayed a long time. Finally, he got tired of staying up there and came back to Paris and gave himself up to the federal authorities. And they tried him, and they turned him loose. And then he came back and lived down at Coffee Mill for a long, long time. And he was in the Spanish-American War. And I forget who was the president. Hayes?
Well, I don't know. That's a little before my time. I don't
I
know.
remember his.
But anyway, he thought that McKinley was president because he named his first daughter McKinley, and they called her Mac. She went on to finish school down there. He owned the school, and he hired the school teacher. But the school teacher had to work and help take care of cows and work on the farm when he wasn't teaching. And they didn't get them but 1 year at a time. But she went on and graduated from down there and went to East Texas State University. Yeah, I think it was called State Normal then. And became a teacher and taught school.
For her daddy?
No, I don't imagine she did. I imagine she taught school otherwise. I remember she taught school, and his middle son, Tom, was killed during the invasion of Normandy.
Now, where did you say they lived?
They lived at Coffee Mill.
Now, where is Coffee Mill?
Well, it's down close to Carson. You know where Coffee Mill Lake is?
Yeah.
Well, it's down in
That's
there.
between Telephone
Mhm,
and Carson.
Yeah, I never will forget Tom called one time, and his car wouldn't run, and he's out of tobacco and out of bread and everything. That is after his wife died. And I went down there, and there was some young men digging down on his place, and he had that old gun that I was telling you about, that old 45-70, and he raised it up and cut a bush down right beside of these boys, and they looked up, and he waved for them to come to him. And he asked them what they was doing, and they told him there was some A&M, and they was going to tell him what they could raise on that soil. And he says, I know what you can raise on that soil. You can't raise anything on it but peanuts. It won't raise anything else. He says, now you boys get out of here and stay out here. He says, I'll cut something down beside the tree next to you next time. And they were willing to go. And I asked him why he didn't close one eye when he shot. And he says, there's no use in it. I can't see out of the other one anyway.
Well, you always seem to have a good twist to all of your stories. I guess that's why you're so interesting to listen to. And we certainly appreciate your talking to us this morning.
Glad to. I hope you can use it.